Scout of the Endless Frontier Episode 13. Beneath a God's Gaze. By Elton Gar. Time moved slower on the frontier. There was very little value in pushing yourself once you had enough food for the winter, since money didn't mean much when there was nothing to spend it on. Most of the time it was even slower for a scout who could spend weeks on their ship, traveling to a world where they found nothing. The last 2 weeks had been a blur. A problem, because Elias had also spent the time healing from a gunshot wound to the stomach. A wound that made it painful to breathe, and almost impossible to do anything else. What he could do was answer the letters that arrived on the pulse. It should have been easy, but after falling asleep 3 times trying to read the same letter, he gave up and had the computer read it to him. It was from a scout who wanted to share some piece of information they thought confirmed the Nexari. Elias almost wrote back that not every artifact or ruined city was connected to the Nexari without reading further. But this was different. The computer read,
"I think the Nexari may be in the vortex, and one of them came out."
There were speculations in a lot of the letters. And the vortex was as good a location as any. There had to be a reason that out of the hundreds of scouts who had entered that area, none had returned. But Nexari didn't attack directly. They sent in their client races to weaken or end civilizations, then if needed they'd step in. But the colony had gone silent. And while Pefri wasn't large when compared to places like Lifton, it was a Nexa colony and one of the major information relay hubs in this part of the frontier. There should be a constant stream of data from it. He ordered the Ghostwake to start in that direction. If it was a Nexari, he was in no position to fight it. Not just because they were virtually gods, but because he could barely walk. But he doubted physical strength was going to be of any use against a virtual god. It wasn't as if you could just stab it. The good news was that Pefri was over a week from his current location at the Ghostwake's best speed. So he changed the autodock settings to prioritize healing quickly. Hopefully by the time he reached Pefri, he could at least walk. Elias then went to sleep. He would heal faster if he slept more, and the autodock encouraged sleep by being as comfortable as possible and injecting him with painkillers and sedatives. So the week went far faster than it had any right to. Though it was filled with strange dreams, painful healing and Rust sitting next to him the whole time. He tried to keep the dog entertained. He would throw his ball from time to time, but while Rust would chase it, there was no enthusiasm, and he didn't return the ball, he just laid down with it and watched Elias. Finally, he simply had the ship read the letters over the ship's intercom constantly. It wasn't much, but Rust understood more than he had any right to understand, and so keeping him informed was more than just a way to entertain him, and Elias heard bits and pieces of information as he went in and out of sleep. When he was a day out, he began to get direct messages from other scouts who had come to Pefri. They told him of a few scouts who had went to the planet, but most of them had waited for Elias. He hadn't told anyone he was coming, but at least it had kept them out of trouble. They confirmed that there was a strange energy coming from Pefri, so as the Ghostwake continued forward, the other scouts followed. Elias searched the energy for a pattern. He didn't find any. Perhaps because weapons didn't need to include a message, they were one. But if it was a weapon, it was one Elias didn't understand. It was perhaps 2 or 3 times the strength of the normal background radiation of the universe. Barely enough to show up on the sensors, and not enough to hurt anyone. But as Elias got closer to the planet, he began to understand. It was as if he was slapped in the face by emotions. The feeling was oppressive, and 2 of the scout ships that had joined him simply turned and left with no message. Good, having the common sense to leave was something that could keep them alive. The emotion itself was a combination of things he had felt, but never in this way, and never this intense. The most powerful of the feelings bordered on fear, but it was more subtle and less useful than fear. Fear was an old friend. It had saved Elias's life nearly as many times as Rust had. But this odd version told him to give up, that fighting or even running was useless. But there were other aspects to it. His mind focused on everything that could go wrong and everything that had. He couldn't help but think about his failings in the past and the belief that nothing could ever be good again. It also, for some reason, made his wounds hurt more. Not just the gunshot in his side, but his knee that had been wounded, and the broken ribs he hadn't thought about in months because they had fully healed. Even the fingers he had broken when he had punched Holt after their first job together hurt. There was something oddly tangible about that pain. Something that cut through the emotional pain. It reminded him of all the things he had survived. Of the pain he had faced and overcome before. Just like the Genik blade reminded him of his oath and the need to be better than he had been in the past, and the Talon reminded him of his need to survive. As another of the scouts turned back, Elias felt the despair of being abandoned. Everyone would abandon him. He'd be left alone, as he had been so often. And if the pain hadn't been there to anchor him, he would have turned back as well. What broke him free was Rust. As soon as they had entered the strange emotional field, the dog had pushed himself up against Elias's leg. Elias petted Rust, who began to whine. Then, seemingly unable to control himself, began to pace the ship, walking in circles. Rust was feeling the same thing Elias was. That decided it. He wasn't going to turn back. He was going to free these people. And with that decided, the feeling of dread retreated. Not entirely, and it grew stronger as he approached the source, but that told Elias what he needed to know. He could push it back. There were several scout ships already in the shipyard, and 3 more landed with Elias. He wondered what pushed them to go into this when it had taken everything Elias had to do it. But then perhaps the same suffering that had taught him how to push back against the pain had given him more pain to use against him. Whatever it was, he was grateful as they stepped out of their identical cheap tin can spaceships. They looked how he felt. Defeated in every way. But they dressed like him. Not an official uniform. Scouts didn't have a uniform. But as close as there was, built from the suggestions that veteran scouts like Elias had sent out on the pulse. Rust moved with him too. Moving to his left side, so that he didn't get in the way of the cane that Elias used to help deal with the pain. The dog's tail was between his legs, his ears were up, and he was so close that he bumped Elias's leg from time to time. That reminder that Rust was with him helped. The dog had chosen to be here, the same way that the other scouts had. He could have stayed on the ghost wake, or just run away. But instead he sniffed the air, then the ground, and then moved forward. It was slow, with none of the exuberance the dog usually had when landing on a planet, but he moved forward. Examining the pressure of emotions, Elias wondered if it was the soul of this place made manifest. Perhaps that was what the Nexari were. The soul of places grown strong enough to force its will on people. The universe's belief that humans, and all like them, were a blight that needed to be eradicated. Without Rust to lead the way, Elias would have had to focus on the emotional pain to know which way to go. He didn't know if that would have broken him. But he was glad to not have to test it. More than that, it gave him no real choice. The only way he could turn back was to leave Rust to this alone, and he had promised he wouldn't leave him. The planet seemed abandoned. Colonies usually had plenty of people outside. Even a colony like this one, that had an industrial purpose, would still grow as much food as it could and gather what it could from the planet. But there was no one in sight. They had all fled, or something worse had happened. Then they stepped into the town's center. There he saw it. Alien, tall, broad, and floating about 10 feet in the air. It didn't glow. It didn't bob or sway. It just stood there, above the ground exactly how it would if it was on the ground. It was the most beautiful thing Elias had ever seen. And he understood why there were hundreds of people standing in the square watching it. It wasn't a physical beauty. It was something far more powerful. When he looked at it, the emotional pain evaporated. It was replaced by elation. Still turbulent and external. There was no calm in this place. But even turning his head to look away from the creature made the exuberant joy fade and the pain begin to return. The most beautiful thing in the universe looked at Elias and said,
"Do not fear your need to stay and worship. It is your place. It was what you were always destined for. And it is my place to protect and nourish you. You will not need food or water, even air is unnecessary when in my presence, for I am your God, and you are my people."
Elias focused all his will to just hold on to himself. To remember the oaths he had taken and the desire to protect people. And he didn't look away, not because he wanted to see it. He could turn away if he wanted to. He was almost certain. But looking firmly at his forehead made it more likely this would work. Elias lifted his hand, the cold curved metal hilt in it, aimed the talon and shot a god in the head. It hit between the eyes. The talon on maximum destroyed most of the head, leaving a perfectly round hole. Somehow, even though it didn't have eyes, the god never broke eye contact with Elias. And he felt a vast and grand indifference to the attack. It wasn't that it hadn't worked. He had shot the god. But it didn't follow the same rules. And as the wound closed, not like something healing, but like someone wiping water off their face, it smiled. Elias couldn't feel despair at his failure. Fear of what would happen next didn't come. Those were impossible while looking at the god. But there was something. It had taken an effort of will to draw that gun, and more to pull the trigger. And as Elias had drawn up his own will, he had pushed back the will of the god. It still assaulted his mind, but he had gained some small amount of free will in the process. Just like he would lose some if he did as the god wanted.
"Are you a Nexari?"
Elias asked. The creature lowered itself and said,
"Where did you learn that word?"
"I was warned of a race called the Nexari, who would kill us."
Elias said. For the first time, there was some emotion on the creature's face as it grinned and said,
"You misunderstand. Nexari are not a race. Nexari is a title. In your language, it means something like expanded one of great power."
"And why are you here?"
Elias asked, beginning to suspect something.
"Fear not. I do not come to destroy you. I come to understand you,"
the Nexari said. This wasn't going how Elias expected.
"Why seek to understand us, if you are going to kill us all?"
One of your philosophers once said, "We are the universe trying to understand itself. It is a limited perspective, but there is in it truth. But like it all experiments, it is in repetition that we learn the limits of the truth."
Every word required an act of will, and every act of will freed Elias from the grip of the other creature. It was a battle he would lose eventually. He'd give in on some tiny thing, and that would snowball until he was as trapped as everyone else. He needed to find a way to end this. So he said,
"I think you're lying."
The creature lowered itself to the ground and walked towards Elias. He said,
"Why would I lie to an amoeba? There is nothing you can do to me, and nothing you can do for me."
"I'm not sure that's true. But I also don't think I'm the one you're lying to."
Elias said, meeting the eyes of a god. He felt the full force of his will again. But this time, he understood better.
"Then who?"
"The only person here worth lying to. You are lying to yourself. The feelings you're projecting outward. The abject suffering, the despair, the inability to see a future worth living. Even a god couldn't understand that without feeling it. Does it help if other people feel the same pain you do? Or is spreading misery only a side effect?
They looked at each other for a minute, and then something strange happened. The Nexari broke eye contact. It lowered its eyes, because it couldn't look into the eyes of an amoeba. And in doing so, it lowered itself and strengthened Elias. Not in the physical sense. The pain still threatened to overwhelm Elias, but in some other more fundamental way. That strength, involuntarily lent to him by the Nexari, allowed Elias to feel the connection more fully. The strength of the mind of the Nexari was overwhelming. It could rip atoms apart and put them together how it wanted. It could rewrite DNA or make him feel any emotion it could imagine. It could understand higher dimensions and see things Elias couldn't understand. But like in so many fights, strength wasn't the most important thing. Elias had fought plenty of enemies stronger than him. He had done it not by using his own strength, but by turning the strength of the enemy against them. So he looked into that connection. He allowed himself to be drawn in, and then pulled himself in further. And he saw the Nexari. It hadn't lied. They were born of the Quinn. A race so ancient that they had built worlds and outlived those worlds and built more. He saw endless lives. Some were good, some were torture. And 1 in a billion was born as something more than most Quinn. Not a Nexari, still a Quinn. But able to do things most Quinn couldn't. They became their kings, queens, generals, and controlled the fate of the Quinn. And of those 1 in 1,000 was born a Nexari. As far above the leaders of the Quinn as their leaders were above them. And he saw the pain of the Nexari. He didn't know if it was universal or simply this individual. But it saw its people and the entire universe caught in a trap. Elias could almost feel what that trap was, but when he pushed the Nexari in that area it pushed back. There, at least, its willpower was greater than what Elias could muster. So Elias allowed it to hold that. And as he did, he felt the power of the creature rebound. Not much, but enough to make it clear. He couldn't back down. He couldn't let it win, no matter how minor or pyrrhic. And the Nexari felt it too, trying to push back again. It all felt impossible. The battle stretched out as time lost all meaning. Elias won almost every battle of wills, and none of them mattered. As he grew stronger, he felt both the fake joy that the creature forced on those who gave into it, and the despair at the same time. He knew that joy was fake. But he understood, perhaps for the first time, how someone who was addicted might feel. It didn't matter if it was fake, if it was better than the torture he faced. Over what seemed years, Elias fought that battle. He refused with everything he could to let his willpower fade, and yet it did. Not through loss, but simple attrition. He was a man fighting a god on the god's own terms. It didn't matter that they were the only terms he could fight the god. And then Rust bit a god's ankle. He didn't know exactly how the dog had done it. Perhaps his battle had drawn too much of the Nexari's attention, or perhaps dogs were more resilient to emotional pain. But Elias thought he knew. Rust already knew this pain and had fought through it once. He had grown up abused. He had been starved, burnt, and kicked by the person who was supposed to protect him. And when he had seen him prepared to do it to someone else, Rust had chosen to ignore that fear and pain to protect someone. Or perhaps he was simply good enough that it wasn't a choice. Whatever it was, the god bled. It was only a few drops as he kicked the dog away. It kicked his dog. And Elias felt his hand go for the talon. But then he moved his hand. As he did, he focused what was left of his will at turning the strength of the Nexari back on it. On returning the emotional pain that it had given him. He felt something else. A mind he had shared a lifetime with, that had receded back to dim memory, moved next to him. Talarian was more fully there than he had been since the vision had ended. Another person who had the strength to fight against the hopelessness that threatened to overwhelm Elias. Elias's anger, and the hope of a mind from before humans even existed, helped Elias to turn the Nexari against itself. And he crumbled. The god had been forcing out that power, because it was already broken by it. And as it crumbled, Elias felt godhood. It wasn't his, and the power flowed through his fingers like water. But for a moment, he understood. This was the Nexari version of a scout. Someone exhausted by life, and desperate enough that he would risk everything to look for something new, and someone unimportant enough that no one cared if they flew out to the edge of nowhere and died. He felt something new as he reached down for the true weapon. This wasn't the evil monster he had imagined. He understood what this Nexari felt. He understood how you could hurt someone out of fear, hopelessness, and anger. And he carried a reminder he wouldn't do that again. That Genik blade was the weapon he needed. A weapon not tied to who he was like the Talon, but who he wanted to be. A person who could be better. A person who not only survived, but deserved to survive. Hope in the form of an oath he had made and would not break. The words were that he would never kill another Genik, and they were true. But there was something deeper that he grabbed onto now. The true oath. To not be the type of person who would kill the Genik. To not be someone who would allow people to become enslaved or suffer. To be better. Tears ran down his face as he raised the dagger. He felt the terror in the Nexari. He saw it in his face. And he saw the beauty in him as well. A god who hadn't even been hurt by a plasma shot to the head. He pushed against the blade. Not physically. Physically, this was no more dangerous to the Nexari than the Talon. But the physical act represented something far deeper. But moving that blade was the hardest thing he had ever done. It was murdering everything good and happy in the universe. He didn't feel it as it touched the Nexari. Then it pierced that shell of flesh that held the power of a god. Elias was thrown backwards hard enough that the wound in his stomach that had barely healed broke open again. The world shifted. The feelings were all gone. Even the pain of his wound seemed nothing. And as people around him fell to their knees and cried out in pain, deeper than physical, Elias thought he might be forgotten. He reached out for Rust, and the dog leaned against him, panting. A young woman, barely a teenager, saw the blood and began to call for help. Most ignored her, but a few crowded around, aware enough that they knew to help Elias. But he barely noticed. Instead, he felt something else. Another group noticing him, noticing anyone that far beneath them for the first time in thousands of years. He didn't know what it meant, but the Nexari knew who Elias Kade was. Author's note:
I hope you enjoyed this mid-season finale. Not the end by any means, but a good place for a short break while I tell other stories from the Commonwealth. I've already put out the first of the tales from the Commonwealth and will be writing The Endeavor, Horizons of the Infinite for a while. The Endeavor is the flagship of a new fleet of corporate-built ships that are designed to help the mega-corporations expand their control of the frontier. Since goodwill is useful to the corporations, the crew will be helping people, but they'll still be working inside a corporate oligarchy, which should help with the tension. And having a few different characters will help in telling a wider variety of stories. I hope everyone will enjoy it, and ultimately, if I can get ahead enough to do it, my goal is to have both going at the same time. But for now, we'll try a few different ways to do this. I hope everyone enjoys it. Elton Gar.